Hello, welcome to episode 119 of the Epic Film Challenge 2, 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die, Floating Weeds, by the legendary Japanese director Yasujiro Ozu, who made so many films over his illustrious career, and this film was made towards the end of his career, and I believe towards the later years of his life. And it's actually a remake of a film he made in the 30s, which was a silent film. I'm supposing that in the 30s, Japan was still making silent films, called A Story, or The Story of the Floating Weeds, something to that effect. So he's, in effect, remaking his own film, but in a later period of cinema, and also in colour. This is one of the few films he made in colour, and it was one that I was very much intrigued by. But I'll admit, knowing that it was in colour, it seemed to kind of, in my mind, rob it of some of the romanticism of these classic Japanese films from the 50s. But once I started watching it, that kind of all melted away, and I had a great time with it. And what I love about Ozu's films, and I've only seen 2 of them so far, including Floating Weeds, is his distinct style that he formed, that he molded and created. You see an Ozu film and you can tell that it's an Ozu film if you know what to look for. And it's not that hard. I mean, really, the key thing that kind of sets it apart from so many other films is that, for one, he never moves the camera. Rarely ever use the camera and move the camera in any of his films, and so every shot is locked off, a static frame. And you see the characters and they're talking and moving, and then we'll cut to another shot. And so it's meticulously framed, and this is something that I found really interesting. And what I did was I listened to the entire commentary that Roger Ebert recorded for this film for Criterion about 10-12 years ago. And it was really interesting, and I love Roger Ebert, and he gave a very interesting discussion over the film that I really enjoyed, because he talks about how Ozu was not that bothered with continuity. He wasn't concerned with matching, he wasn't concerned with eye lines, he wasn't concerned with the basic rules of cinematography that so many other directors adhere to so strictly. He didn't care about the 180-degree rule. You know, he would break it. You know, he didn't care, and he wanted to tell the story the way he wanted to tell it, and he wanted to film it and frame it the way he wanted to frame it. And there is a scene in this film, Floating Weeds, which I found very disconcerting and kind of confusing to watch, where 2 characters are talking to each other over a table, and when we cut to the one character looking at the other character, he's looking past him, but he's looking at the camera. And so it's this weird kind of disorienting kind of thing, and Roger Ebert was arguing that it makes no difference. I will say that one scene that I'm thinking of in Floating Weeds, I did find a bit... It took me out of it. I didn't like it, I'll admit. But I do admire Ozu for this philosophy of not caring about continuity, not caring about the rules. And his kind of methodology revolved around making every frame of his films composed aesthetically. You know, so anytime that the camera moves, or moves to the next shot, I should say, not literally moves on screen, but anytime he would move the camera to set up the next shot, he'd move stuff around on the set. Even if the bottle was there before, he'll move it here because it looks better in this next shot, and it frames things well, and that's in the foreground, gives you some perspective to the background. That's what Ozu liked to do, and I find that very interesting, and I find that very inspiring at the same time. That he didn't care about these things called continuity mistakes. As long as the film looked good and the story was interesting. And I really like that. Though I will say, the eyeline matching scene that I'm thinking of in Floating Weeds, it did throw me off a little bit, I will admit. So I don't think it's a foolproof methodology by any means, but I really found it interesting and fascinating to hear about from Roger Ebert, because he knew a bit about Ozu and I didn't really know that much. So I highly recommend listening to commentaries if you're really interested in films. Sometimes it's a crapshoot, you might not get the information you want, but this one from Roger Ebert was really great, and I highly recommend you checking it out if you can, trying to track it down. I actually downloaded it and found it, so it is possible to do that. Anyway, the film Floating Weeds, just to get into this, very simple story. It's set in this coastal town, and a group of traveling performers arrive. A kabuki show, I believe it's called. I hope I didn't get that wrong. This group of traveling theatre performers, they'll travel to a town, they'll set up, and they'll perform their show for 6 months or so, and then once the money starts drying up, they'll move on to the next town. They live this traveling gypsy life in a way. And the film opens, the theatre group arrives in town, and then they start trickling through the town, and we see all these different characters and things. And what I love about it is the main character of the film, the master. He's called the master of the theatre group. This old man, well, not old, but middle-aged certainly. He's the main character of the film, without a doubt, but you don't really get clued into that until maybe 15-20 minutes into the film, when you start to realise, based on the story and what you're seeing, that this is going to be the main character. I mean, he's in the opening scenes of the film, but Ozu doesn't make this apparent. He doesn't, zoom in, because the camera doesn't move, and he doesn't cut to a close-up of the master. He's just there with everyone else, and so you just have to kind of just receive everything, and it feels like real life. You need to have the time to figure out these things, and it's Ozu doesn't make films that kind of tell you exactly what this film is going to be about, and even throughout the entire film, it very much feels like scenes from a life. There's not this this tightly wrought plot that really just moves along with every single scene, and every time someone's talking, they're moving along the plot. The pacing of this film is glacial, and I could see people not getting on with it. You really need to sit down for 2 hours with this and just let it wash over you. And there is this contemplative tone to it, where you're sitting there and you're watching these scenes where sometimes not a lot is happening, or there's silence and things like that, and you start projecting your own feelings onto it, or at least I did, and my own experience with people. Do I know someone like that, and I start thinking about them, and that could be a detriment to the film, then it makes your mind wander. But at the same time, I was interested enough in the story that I kept focused in on the film, while also kind of bringing my own psyche into it, I felt like. And I've seen people write this about Ozu's films, and I totally agree with it. That's definitely how I kind of gelled with this film. This contemplative pace and tone really worked for me, and the drama is not really over the top, and the story is a story that could very much be something that someone else would take, and they would make it explode with drama towards the end. And basically, the master of the theatre group, he has a history with this small coastal town that they've come to at the beginning of the film. He'd been there before with the theatre group, 12 years earlier, and before that. And he actually has this illegitimate son. And so he goes to revisit his old flame and her son. But he is known to his son as his uncle. And so there's this family secret. And he doesn't want his son to know that he's this theatre performer, because he knows he'd look down on him, and he doesn't want him to look down on his father like that. He'd prefer him to not know who his father is. And so you have this story that, where it's basically about this father-son relationship, and how this uncle spends time with his nephew, but really it's a father and son kind of bonding, and it's an interesting relationship. And then other people get involved. There's the master's mistress. There is another young girl who gets caught up with the master's son. And so we have this kind of interesting set of characters that are all kind of involved with each other in some way, and then they start to kind of bleed over into each other. And we do get some dramatic scenes, but it doesn't explode with drama, and it feels just, and I think it goes with the Japanese culture as well, that they're not a very, or at least the impression that I get from watching contemporary Japanese films, or films, that are set in the time that the films are made, not these period, samurai films. I always get the feeling that the Japanese are quite reserved, and they hold back from a lot of their feelings, and so there's a lot unsaid, and that certainly is true in this film, and it is set in present day. It's not a period piece. And I really liked the humour of the film too. It raised a few chuckles. It didn't feel like it was comedy that was overplayed, and it just kind of fit the naturalistic feel of the whole film. And I have to give credit to the lead actor, Ganjirō Nakamura, who plays the master, plays the leader of the troupe, because his performance really anchors the film. It's a really layered performance, and we get to see the progression of his character, which is so interesting. And he can go from one moment appearing as giddy as a young child when he sees his son for the first time, all grown up. He's so happy, and then he goes to this stone-faced, kind of very cruel man. But you can almost begin to understand how he's become this way because of his life, and I just think that Nakamura nailed it in this film, and he's what really makes it great. I loved the way this film looked, the way it was shot. Just great cinematography. It was shot by the guy who did Rashomon, so great cinematographer in this film, but also Ozu clearly knew where to place the camera. It's just aesthetically pleasing images, and it really is one of those films where you can pause it on almost any single shot of the film, and as Roger Ebert said, I mean, I'm lifting this from his commentary, it looks like a great photograph you could hang on the wall, and it goes back to that famous thing, every frame a painting, and it really is almost like that. Not many films can say that they are. In fact, I don't think there's any film where you can say every single frame is a painting, but I think that this one is really close. And I'm eager to check out more of Ozu's filmography to see if that's the same. And certainly the other film I've seen, Tokyo Story, was just composed and framed beautifully, and this is, again, no exception. I love the way that he shot this film. I love the deep focus where everything is in focus and you can see everything that's used throughout most of the film. So just stylistically, from the visuals, I really enjoyed this film, but I really enjoyed the story too, and I enjoyed how slowly it moved and how it rolled along, and how interesting how interested I was in the characters, and how interesting it was to see them go through this story and this period of their lives in this small coastal town. It was a great setting. You know, I love all the houses and just the Japanese style of everything. So I'm predisposed to enjoy this movie, even if it wasn't good with the characters and the story and the cinematography. But I love this film, suffice it to say. Really, really, really enjoyed it. It wasn't anywhere near the level of Tokyo Story, which I'll talk about again at some point in this series because it's also in the book, but I need to rewatch that film. But this one, yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. I think it's a great film. I don't think it's a masterpiece, but I think it's a great film. And I love the characters, and I like the way that it ended. I like the, you know, just this, there's lots of memorable moments in it that aren't overtly memorable, if you understand what I'm saying. I just it really surprised me because it's a very quiet film. It's a very simple film, but it works if the characters and the story hooks you in, and it really did hook me in. So there we go, Floating Weeds, and the title Floating Weeds kind of refers to the theatre group themselves. They're these floating weeds who are just kind of passing through, and so we get to see this one instance of them passing through, and you wonder about the future of this theatre group, and whether, because, you know, it's set in present day in the 1950s, where, you know, this kind of travelling theatre group is not really popular anymore, and so that is a part of it as well. This old master who is perhaps delusional about whether they can sell tickets to these things, and that his old style, and clearly his entire life of doing this travelling theatre act, is coming to a point in society where people aren't interested anymore. So he very much gets faced with that as well. He gets faced with perhaps the end of his livelihood, and whether he should, you know, decide to call it a day and try something else. But then what else does he know? So there's lots of interesting character motivations and repercussions in this story, but a lot of them, you know, are just there for you to kind of pick at yourself and kind of decide, you know, where it's going to go. It's definitely not a film that kind of ties everything up neatly in a nice little package at the end of it. My favourite scene was probably this kind of big kind of argument that happens in the film between the master and his mistress, and he's really pissed off at her, and she's really pissed off at him, and she runs out into the street and it's pissing down rain, and she walks underneath the kind of the balcony of the front of one of these houses, and he's underneath the balcony on the opposite side of the street, and she stood there, and he's walking back and forth like a panther almost, just shouting at her and stuff, and calling her a bitch and all this kind of stuff, and the water is separating them, this rain that's pounding down, and it's kind of causing this barrier between them, both physically and emotionally. And I thought it was such a great scene, and then there would be moments where it would cut to him looking right into the camera and shouting at her, and then she'd be looking right into the camera, so you're faced with it head on. It's thrown right in your face, this argument. There's no escaping from it, you know, and at the same time they're separated by this rain. I thought it was a beautifully kind of composed image, just from a storytelling perspective, but also just the way they were acting and performing this kind of intense kind of argument was great. So that was probably the highlight of the film for me. Anyway, is it a film you must see before you die? I'm going to say yes, but it's a hesitant yes, because to me Tokyo Story is one of those spoilers, an instant yes. This one not so much, but I do think it is worth checking out, because you could get out of it what I got out of it, in which case you would really, really enjoy it and think that it was a great film. But I also think there's a very high probability that people would be bored by this film and they wouldn't get on with the pacing, which is fine. So I'm going to say yes. I think this should be seen. But I haven't seen, you know, hardly any of Ozu's films at all, so it could be a case where he has much better films that aren't in the book. I don't know. But for me, it's a hesitant yes. I think it's a great film, but I don't think it's a surefire masterpiece or anything like that. But I'll say yes, it probably is a film you should see before you die, because it could enlighten you to the films of Ozu. it could enlighten you to Japanese films in general. I don't know, but I certainly think that it has something there that is special and is unique, and perhaps that is indicative of Ozu's entire filmography. I don't know, but it has its own style, its own pace and rhythm, and its own unique quality that I think is worth checking out. Thank you for watching.